Hi. So nice to meet you all. Yeah, my name's Jeff Snyder, as she said. I work at Princeton. I'm director of electronic music there, which means a few different things. The main things is that I'm the director of the Princeton Laptop Orchestra, also known as PLORC, and I lead a research lab called Neural, the New Instrument Research Lab. The stuff I'm gonna talk about today doesn't focus as much around my work as the leader of PLORC, but is more on kind of my instrument building and composition world. I also founded a company called Snyder Phonics that you mentioned, and in general, I'm a composer, improviser, musician. Which kind of brings me to this question of, I often get asked, oh, are you an instrument designer or are you a composer? Or, which one are you really doing, And a lot of times, sometimes it makes sense for those things to be specialized, but in my own experience, I've found that I can do a lot more just completely integrating them as much as possible. I feel like in general, to do it very well, it's a feedback loop where musical ideas are gonna suggest an instrument design to me, like, oh, in order to do this music, I gotta build a new thing. And then once I make the instrument, then I'm like, oh wait, but I could also do this. And then musical ideas come out of that too. So for me, that ends up being kind of the way that things work. It always goes around and around. Just for a little context, I want to kind of introduce you to where I'm coming from and kind of what I see myself as trying to do. There's kind of two major influences that I name check a lot. One of them is Harry Partch. So I kind of see myself heavily inspired by the world of Harry Partch. And he's this guy who didn't really, he was interested in alternate tuning systems back when nobody was really paying attention to that stuff. And he wanted to play music using that, but there weren't really instruments designed for that purpose, so he just built a bunch of instruments of his own. And this is him kind of sitting in this world of instruments that he built to perform his own music, which was this strange mix between kind of what he imagined ancient Greek music and theater to be, and also hobo songs and stuff like that. So I've found him really inspiring, and I generally think I think of myself as kind of trying to do that sort of thing. Like I'm building up a body of instruments to make my own body of work. And that's kind of where me building instruments comes from. Like when I was in undergrad, I got excited about this, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna build a bunch of instruments and try to make music on them. The other major influence is David Tudor, who you could maybe consider him the founder of the noise table. If you have gone to a show and seen somebody with like a table full of pedals going crazy, he was doing that in like the 60s. And I think of him as a major influence to me because he was coming out of it as originally a performer who was then, got interested in electronics through working with John Cage. And but then he kind of moved into building his own electronic circuits and became a performer, composer, improviser on those circuits. But really he was sort of driven by the musical needs to make little circuits for himself and kind of build this system that he could influence. Which kind of gets to, there's a quote from Harry Partch that I really like that I think encapsulates what I'm striving to, where he says that he's not an instrument maker, he's a philosophical music man seduced into carpentry. So it's like, why am I doing this? So because I got seduced into carpentry through what I wanted to do musically. So a lot of this talk is going to focus a bit more in depth on a later instrument, my most recent one, the Electrosteel. But I'm going to give kind of a little whirlwind tour before that of some other instruments that I made so that you can get some context. And also because it sort of brings up some of the questions and problems that I end up addressing with those instruments and kind of why I'm building these things along the way. So it'll feel a little bit like a whirlwind adventure of kind of like a bunch of different instruments that I've made and why I made them. But hopefully it'll be interesting. So these are two of my earliest instruments. I made these in grad school as part of my dissertation. They're called the tenor contravielle and the treble contravielle. And these were really based on the idea of kind of making an electronic instrument that felt like an acoustic instrument in some ways. I wanted to be able to do synthesis, synthesizer sounds, but I was also kind of inspired by Harry Parch. I wanted to do weird alternate tunings that change dynamically, which would have been really hard to do on acoustic instruments. And then the other thing about them, so I kind of abstracted the idea of a string instrument to create this thing. I was like, I'll try to make something that a string instrument player could play. What does that mean? That means like over here on your left hand, you've got some kind of something that feels like you're fretting along the strings or fingering the strings and choosing pitches that way. And maybe on your right hand, you're actuating the strings somehow, like you're choosing amplitude or you're triggering things. That was the basic idea, which there have been a lot of instruments that try to do this, right? So synth guitars and whatnot. This was my approach to it. One thing, they don't really look that much like a traditional synth guitar like the Casio DG1 or something because they're not made out of plastic, for one thing. And also their shape is not really intended to look like a guitar. I was kind of trying to get away from those sort of things. There's an instrument called the nyckelharpa from Sweden that was a strong influence of where it's like keys that you're pressing, sort of like buttons you're pressing with the left hand and then you're bowing with the right hand. And I liked that idea of kind of inexpressive left hand and expressive right hand. So I was trying to capture that a little bit. But then the other reason that there would is that I wanted, and this is coming from David Tudor's work, I wanted to have the electronic sound be made acoustic by vibrating something. So the instrument itself is not just goes to a speaker and then that's your sound, but rather the instrument makes the sound. And I was doing that these are kind of constructed like traditional acoustic instruments where there's a spruce top plate and there's a transducer screwed into the back of it that's then vibrating the top plate. So the F-holes aren't just for looks. They're also kind of for looks. But yeah, that was kind of fun. I feel like these were sort of successful instruments. They sounded cool. They were hard to play, and they probably would give people tendinitis if they played them a lot. So I had a lot to learn about what you should pull from if you're trying to make something that takes advantage of performers' skills. I had a lot to learn about which things actually matter that you need to be able to pay attention to, like why acoustic instruments are made a certain way or another way. And that's a really hard thing to pull apart because it's like, I don't know, why does the violin have this thing? Maybe it's tradition. Maybe it's because of something that doesn't matter for these. Or maybe it's because your thumb needs to be in this position, otherwise you hurt yourself. I don't know. So these instruments have been a bit of an experiment to learn those things. These are some other ones from my dissertation called the resophonic manta and the bass manta. These were kind of the keyboard instruments of the ensemble I was imagining. So they both have these little keyboard things on the top that had capacitive touch sensor array that you're basically selecting pitches on. But then, like the other ones, they have these acoustic resonators, and I focused a lot of energy into that. Like, how do I make some interesting sounding instruments that have their own voice and sound very unique, that don't just sound like, oh, you put it through a speaker, it could sound like anything, but rather their body, the body of the instrument is such a strong filter that you could recognize it by its sound, was kind of my goal. There's a trade-off to that of then it really has a certain sound it's not flexible in the way that maybe we want electronic instruments to be, which becomes kind of a back and forth trade-off that I've struggled with in the 15 years since I've been doing these kind of things, where it's like, okay, but then if it really always sounds like that thing, then okay, what if I want it to sound like something different, you know? Anyway, but these sort of taught me quite a few different things. One thing that kind of grew out of this particular instrument, these guys, was that the keyboard thing that I built for the top of them, well, okay, before I talk about that, I'll show a little video of these four instruments together. This is a piece called Undeciphered Writing that I wrote for them. I kind of thought of these as a group of, this is the second piece I wrote for this, and I kind of thought of them as a group so that I could make this alternate reality early music that I was working on at the time. Sort of like, oh, what if it's the 1600s, but somebody invented electricity a lot earlier, and this is like the music that would come out of it, was my weird little idea. So this is an excerpt from one of those pieces. So I wrote two larger pieces for this full kind of consort of instruments that I imagined, concerning the nature of things and then undeciphered writing. And since then, this piece is from 2012, 2013 or something. Since then, I've been focusing mostly on some other instruments and kind of taking some lessons from these instruments in the next things that I built. One thing is that those keyboards that I put on top of the resonators sort of ended up having a life of their own. I was the only person interested in like a giant resonator with a resophonic cone, and you need a van to take it to the gig and all this stuff. But a bunch of people, when they saw those things, were like, oh, that's a really cool controller. I want to use that for something. So this instrument that I originally made for myself, and kind of, the design is influenced by a lot of things. Why is it a hexagonal grid? It's because alternate tuning theories often are visualized on a hexagonal grid based on this 19th century theory of tonets. So, there's stuff like that where I was like, oh, why not make it a hexagon grid? Then I can do these just intonation patterns and stuff. And why is it sort of continuous sensor data on each finger? It's like, well, I wanted to be able to fade in notes and do this kind of polyphonic aftertouch thing. But then those features also interested other people for other reasons. So this is the instrument that I ended up making that the most people have played, where I ended up turning this into kind of a product as its own standalone thing that I sold about 200 of over the years. And a bunch of people did all kinds of different music with it, using it as a controller. So it's just a controller that sends to a computer data over USB and says how much surface area you're covering on each sensor, basically, and it has a big frame of all of the data. Which it was kind of exciting to me to hear, like, some people used it as a lighting controller, and some people used it to mess with robot arms, and some people made all kinds of different music with it, or, dance music, or totally experimental noise music, or whatever, and people are still sending me videos of, like, doing new weird stuff with it that I didn't expect. Here's a video of one of my friends, Sam Pluta, who became kind of a virtuoso on it. Doing something that was very far from my original idea of like, oh, it's just intonation, pitches, and you fade them in and whatever, right? That's pretty far away from that, but it was very interesting to me that's kind of where it ended up for him. So I was always kind of very proud that a lot of people used this instrument, but there was something that bothered me about it too, which is, I don't really think it's an instrument. It's a controller, and I think there is a pretty big distinction. It's a controller because it really just sends data to a computer, and you could do whatever you want with that data. But the instrument maybe is the combination of the controller and some software. In this case, Sam Pluta wrote his own custom software and super collider that decided what this instrument does and has its own distinct sound, right? But like, I couldn't listen to a record and be like, oh, somebody's playing the Manta on this record, because I don't know, what does a Manta sound like? It could just sound like bad general MIDI trumpet sounds or something, right? Probably should. But this kind of has bothered me a little bit, and it's put this goal into my head of wanting to make some things that are true instruments and trying to define to myself what that should mean, and then also wanting to make instruments that I set myself kind of a goal of, it'd be really cool if I could make an instrument where somebody could play it on a record and I wouldn't know that that was happening, but then I'd hear it, I'd go, oh, I made that, that's that instrument, right? Which is honestly really hard, because especially with electronic stuff, electronics can make any sound you can imagine is this dream, right? But part of the problem is then you lose identity, right? It's like the more flexible something is, the less identity it has. But I'm really influenced and I admire things like the Rhodes piano or something where there's this electromechanical thing that makes this particular sound that you could try to simulate it, but you're not really going to get there unless you have this model that you're trying to simulate. It's such a unique sort of thing. And And I've been wanting to make instruments that are more like that in some way. And that's what I've been working towards quite a bit in my career since then. The Manta had a little, another life in a way too, where at some point I came out with the Manta Mate module, which lets you kind of use the Manta as a controller for modular synths. And that was actually, in some ways, it's like, oh, okay, it's just a thing that makes the Manta talk to modulars in the way it talked to a computer before. But it actually was a really interesting design problem for me, because in the case of making the Manta as a controller for a computer, I didn't have to care what the sensors meant, because I'm just sending the data, and then I tell the person, oh, you got to make a max patch or something, figure out what it does. But if I'm making something that then talks to a module, okay, now I got to decide, what do those pads mean? How are they going to light up? What does it mean? What is the interaction? How does it interface, right? And that was a really fun project, actually. I spent several years working on it, and people got very annoyed waiting for it, but eventually I came out with it. And it's got, but I kind of determined a whole bunch of different things that, the Manta could do, and I tried to build those in as these modes in the module. And that's actually ended up being really inspiring to me. I've never actually, until recently, I never really thought of the Manta as, it's like an instrument that I made, and then a bunch of people bought it and use it, but it's never actually been my main instrument. I built this other thing called the JD1 keyboard thing and like the year after I made the Manta, and then that's been what I've been playing for a long time. But actually recently, when I made the Manta Mate, it kind of brought me back to the Manta, because it became really fun to use these features that I built into it that I just thought, people would like it if it could do sequencer things. And they'd like it if it could be like a TB303 kind of baseline generator or something. And I built those things, but I didn't really look carefully at how sequencers and TB303s and stuff work. I just kind of was like, it'd be neat if you select the stuff this way, right? And I ended up with something that feels a little more unusual to me and gives a lot of control that those things don't normally give. And to me, in a way, I feel like the Manta Mate makes the Manta feel more like an instrument to me, because it adds those limitations and these affordances that have kind of more of a circumscribed space. Here's like a little bit of me making some electronic dance music with the Manta Mate. So, and actually just put out an album in September. That's all me making music just with Manta and Manta Mate and some modules that I built on my modular synth. And that was really fun. It's ended up being kind of a real source of musical inspiration that I didn't expect in this case. In this part of the feedback loop, I built this instrument, and then I modified the instrument due to other people's needs, and then I ended up making a lot of music based off what it ended up being able to do. Which was very inspiring for me, and I liked that part. I liked that part of the feedback loop a lot, where I'll build something and then it gives me ideas. So yeah, here's a few other instruments that I made. Most of them I won't talk about in detail, but they're kind of these in the middle period between kind of Manta and those earlier instruments, and my most recent instruments, which are the Electrobase and the Electrosteel, and the Vocodec. I was making these things. So one of them, the top there, is called the Burl. That's my wind instrument, kind of. This is the JD1 that I mentioned that was kind of my main performance instrument as an improviser for a long time. It's basically a piano keyboard, touch-sensitive piano keyboard, but also a sequencer and a modular synth controller. It's kind of interesting. I like it a lot. This is the drum box, which was my attempt to make a percussion instrument, kind of a frame drum idea. That's the feedback trombone with Matty Barbier and Weston Olenke there demonstrating it, which was my attempt at controlling Larsen effect, which is like you point a microphone at a speaker and then makes a howling sound, right? But I was like, what if you could control that howling sound? Maybe put it inside a tube, and then you're going to get feedback at a resonance of the tube. Maybe you could telescope the tube, and then you could get different fundamentals and different overtone series. Oh, wait a minute, somebody made an instrument that already is a telescoping tube. So then I basically adapted a trombone to do my kind of feedback control, which was really fun. But also kind of, just a little aside on that thing, that also got into that territory of, is this, whether adding, making the space of possibility smaller ends up kind of, helping or hurting. With the feedback trombone, I was like, I really want to make it so that you can play specific notes with feedback, which is like, that'd be really hard, right? Wiggle around a microphone on a speaker. But if it's in this telescoping tube and then you put a filter in the feedback loop so that you can force it to one of those possible overtones, maybe you could play it like a trombone, basically. But actually, the closer I got to that, of being able to actually control it, the more it just sounded like a sine wave. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute, why did I just make a really hard way to make a sine wave play the note you want? So I kind of went backwards a little bit when I was working with these two guys, trying to figure out how to get some of the life back in the feedback sounds. Okay, well, what is it that controlling it so much took away? What's the cool part of feedback? Actually, it's kind of when one note goes into another harmonic through this kind of, suddenly it breaks into the high one, but it's not a do, it's a do, right? So how do I capture that? So that's kind of what later developments of that moved into, which has been a fun problem, but one that I haven't really solved. I want to get back to it. At some point, I will. And then over here is another version of the burl. This is actually, so I'll talk a little bit about the development of the burl here, because it's kind of I think it's an interesting path. I wrote a paper about the adventure of the burl and it going through all these different iterations. So it's a chapter in a book. If you want to look it up, it's kind of fun thinking through how this instrument that I consider the same instrument ends up becoming very distinct things that other people wouldn't think is the same instrument. I call them all the burl, though. So this was the original burl, the 2009 version that I made for my dissertation as part of that piece, because I wanted a wind instrument in the piece. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll have a little something you blow in, something you have some finger holes, right, with buttons. It's kind of a lot like those the contraviel string instrument things where there's some buttons or whatever, but it's got a breath sensor. But then I also wanted it to have its own really identifiable sound, and I was playing around a little bit at the time with spinning a motor to get an oscillation. If you put electricity into a motor, it turns, but if you turn the motor, and it generates current, so a generator and a motor are just the same thing backwards. So I was kind of using that as a way to generate signal and change the amplitude of it with the breath sensor. That was really fun. At some point, I went a little crazier and got really complicated with it, and ended up building this kind of standalone belt drive synthesizer that this wind controller thing would communicate with, and make some sounds. I'll play a little bit of what this thing sounds like, just to show kind of give you an idea. So this is, I also found that it sounded really different. So, okay, you want to turn a motor in order to get an oscillation to come out. But then if you send electricity to that motor, then you're not able to turn it by hand and get the signal out. So I need another motor to turn the first motor. And then I need to connect them somehow. So one way is I could connect them with a friction belt, like a rubber band. And if I do that, it sounds like this. Silence. No. Where's my sound? There we go. All right. So that's just like playing a little phrase. One thing I really like about that is there's this kind of whipping as it goes up into the high thing. It's like, doo, woo, woo, woo. That's actually just the rubber of the belt snapping, because it's trying to speed up to this new speed for the motor turning, but the belt takes a little bit to catch up. I found that super interesting, and I really liked that articulation detail in a way. And then it changes depending on how you do that drive connection. So another version of it is using a timing belt, which is more like in your printer, there's a little thing with a bunch of ridges that makes it so you get a really precise thing when the printer head moves around or something. So that sounds like this. Kind of like it. It's in that way. It's like, oh, you lose that whipping, but it also has this weird gurgle to it, kind of from the resolution of the notches on the timing belt. Anyway, I found this super interesting and spent a lot of time on it, but it always had a bunch of just general problems, like motors generate heat, but they also make a lot of noise. So I put them in a box to isolate the noise, but then now it gets really hot, and engineering problems. At the time, I wish that I'd known about heat pipes, which is a way to get heat out without an air transfer. Sometime I'll pop back into that and try that idea. But in general, it was kind of like a really complicated instrument to bring around, and it often broke on my trip to a gig and stuff. So at some point, I kind of started focusing on the controller side of it, of this wind controller, and I made a new version of the Brill that really doesn't have that electromechanical oscillator, but it's just basically a wind controller with these continuous sensors instead of buttons. I wanted to make like an open-hold wind controller, like a recorder has open holes, or like a bansuri bamboo flute, things like that. So rather than on-off digital buttons. Awesome.
That is beautiful.
So, all right. That's Pedro Eustache trying it out. And this was kind of fun, but also made me a little disappointed with myself that I'm like, oh yeah, this stuff already exists. There's already wind controllers. There's this thing called the Iwi by Niall Steiner a long time ago made that, and Akai sells it. There's Yamaha's version. What am I really adding to it? Just the fact that it has continuous key sensing. But it was interesting for me, and it was a problem to solve. One thing about the sound of that, you could hear kind of it's bending as he does these kind of open hold gestures. And I do think that's an unusual thing about it. And to me, in a way, that kind of convinced me that interaction could make an identifiable sound in a way that I had originally thought would need to come from something like an electromechanical oscillator or a vibrating body, but just the fact that that interaction generates a different gesture than even if the sound is, in that case, that was just a triangle wave, synthesized triangle wave coming from a computer. But I feel like it has kind of an identifiable character to it. So that discovery kind of interested me and feeds a lot into the last instrument I'm going to show you in a bit. Yeah. But other things about this, why is it made out of wood? I think wood looks really pretty. All the existing wind instruments that are commercially electronic wind instruments are plastic and metal. Electronic musical instruments always, this plastic and metal stuff. And I kind of feel like these traditional instruments have more of a vibe, and there's something about more than just like doing the job, but also feeling good in your hands and like feeling like an instrument that will produce good music with you that I feel like is often lost in the sort of efficiency of mass-produced electronic instruments. Also, why the bend in the mouthpiece? Because I thought it looked cool. I think sax players don't necessarily have this association, but I just associate like this with like Kenny G, and all the existing wind controllers are that sort of thing. I know like John Coltrane played the soprano sax too, okay. But to me, this is cooler. So I just like wanted to do that. And this is sort of a thing about a lot of my instruments is like, okay, there's, I'm making these choices, but they're really aesthetic choices about what I think would be feel good as a musician and what I think would be cool. I'm not doing any kind of user studies to figure this stuff out. It makes me, in some ways, less of a researcher, right? I'm kind of doing this stuff because I want to, but not really, and based on my own goals. So, but I was wondering, would its sound still be recognizable? I think it is in some ways. All right, so then, here I am, I've made a bunch of different stuff. I'd tried like string instruments, wind instruments, brass instruments, percussion, keyboards. I was sort of trying to put together my instrumentarium the way that Harry Partch had all those instruments around him, right? So what am I missing? I don't know, a few different things, but first of all, maybe voice. I'll skip a little bit quickly through this, but for a little while, but this brings in something that becomes kind of important for my development of these things. So I had a country band for a long time. I have an alter ego as a country musician named Owen Lake, and I have a band, The Tragic Loves. And Owen Lake often sings through a vocoder, but I was getting really tired of bringing my computer to gigs, so I wanted to just build myself a little embedded vocoder pedal, right? And also, all the existing vocoder pedals that I had tried a couple, and they didn't sound good to me. And I like using like LPC for vocoding rather than channel vocoder stuff, so I basically had to build my own hardware. So that's where I ended up making this instrument called the Vocodec, which was just to solve my problem of wanting to play live with a vocoder that I liked the sound of. Here's a little bit of me playing with that instrument.
Always knew someday that I would lose you when those lies about me were revealed. It's plain to see, sweetheart, that you believe them, and it's alright if that's the way you feel. I know that I will always go on caring, and my feelings now I must conceal. I still need you, and I want you with me.
All right, so that's If That's the Way You Feel by Owen Lake. Yeah, maybe I'll skip this one, but this is another example if you want to look up more examples of the Vocodec on a recording or something. That's one that I used it on. So once I'd made a little pedal, then, I've got a cool pedal with a microphone and preamp, and maybe I should add some other effects to it. So I just kind of started building out more effects. And here's like a little video showing a few different ones.
Burned it in our presence, and the Chancellor had to write and rewrite till his...
I like that one.
Fourteen, 12, 9, 21, 5, 12, 9, 21.
16, 20, 14, 8, 3.
I'm going to add in some of the input signal, that voice again.
Yeah. Anyway, so let me actually, I might skip this, but basically, this sort of brings up, okay, but what's the research question? I made a vocal multi-effects processor. Those already exist. And they're pretty good, like Eventide makes a really good one. There's a bunch of really good ones out there. So, I don't know. I didn't write a paper about this one. I haven't been able to figure out what the research question is, if there is one, but in the process, I learned a whole bunch and I made an instrument that I like. I added this to my consort of instruments, learned a lot about programming effects. I've got a Leaf audio library. If you're interested, look it up. This is a library I've been developing for a long time. That's just straight C a bunch of audio components. That's what I'm using in all my instruments these days. And it's designed for embedded system stuff. But I added a whole bunch of stuff to that through building things into this Vocodec box. Also, I ended up using it in other ways too. You heard in those examples, there was the one sound that kind of sounded like strings vibrating. That was a physical model of strings feeding back and resonating. So it's a computational model pretending to be strings feeding back at some way with being touched at a certain point to get harmonics. And I did end up using that a bunch in other music, using this pedal in other ways as like a string controller. So here's a little bit from my recent album that just came out where I'm using that. The feedback sound in this is from the Vocodec string model. Yeah. Okay, so then also I made a few of these and sort of lent them out to different players, and a lot of people have ended up integrating that into their performance, which has been really neat. I feel like now the stage I'm at on this, I want to make a new revision based on some feedback I've gotten from some performers. Mirtha Kadambi plays it as part of her live set, and it's been really interesting to me to see what she does with it. Yeah. What else is missing? Well, there's plucked strings. So in my band, on the records for Owen Lake, the bass lines are all synthesized because that's the sound I want, this kind of 80s new wave kind of kind of stuff. But I'm also not that interested in having somebody do this on stage with a keyboard, and I like this just visually. I think it feels cooler to have a bass player. So in the live bands, this is Jerome Wells, who plays bass for Owen Lake, and he's really just normally playing an electric bass and maybe using some kind of pedal to try to make it sound like a synth. But this sort of brought me to my next challenge, which was like, I'd like to make an instrument that the bass player in Owen Lake could play and then sound like the synth sounds on the record. Which kind of is like, okay, and what am I trying to do now? Like another guitar synth? Those exist too. Probably the most notable one is something like the Syntax. Pretty cool. I feel like it looks really dorky, but it's a really awesome instrument in a lot of ways. And then there's other things, the Casio stuff. Yamaha has things. But I set about to try to do it myself. This was my first prototype, really, really hacky. All of my instruments start as really hacky looking stuff, so they only get shiny later. And then second prototype, this is Pierre-Alexandre Tremblay, maybe some of you know him, Canadian dude, connected to some research here, I think. And then eventually it turned into this prototype, and that's what I've got right here. So I was gonna do a really quick little demo. So this is the Electrobase, and it ends up being, it's kind of a, it's basically a bass synth controller. Those exist, but I was trying to make a good one that does some things other ones don't do. One thing is it's fretless, not a lot of... which is kind of fun. And then the other thing is, I don't know. I wanted to have it have its own built-in sound, so it's not a controller for a computer, but it's just running its own little embedded synthesis stuff. So you can just plug it into an amp and go. And I'm still working on this one. I've only got a couple prototypes, and I haven't lent it out to anybody to really try yet. And the guy in the Owen Lake band doesn't have one yet. So still working on it. Got a few bugs to work out, but it's been pretty fun, and it can sound like a lot of different things. It can also do like stringy physical model-y stuff and whatever, all kinds of crazy noises. Doesn't have to be a bass, you know. But I did find bass interaction to be a pretty interesting goal for it. Here's like, oh yeah. Wow. This is Leo Caputo trying it out. I also wrote music for it, like in my sort of alternate reality early music style. So this is sideband playing that. But then also I'm playing another instrument here, so that's the last thing I want to talk about. What's missing from the list? The most important instrument of all, slide guitar. Yeah, so everybody knows that. So I wanted to make a slide guitar, and this is the one I've spent most of my time working on in the last several years. Basically, it was my COVID project, and I'm still working on it. I made a thing called the Electrosteel, which is, I was designing at the same time as this, and it's basically exactly the same technology. So it just kind of like was like, okay, I'll make a bass, and I'll also use the same stuff, but what would have to be different if it was a slide? But this kind of gets to this stuff where it's like, I'm trying to borrow interaction from something and then make it be able to control synthesis. In this case, the pedal steel guitar is what I was interested in, which is kind of a crazier version of the slide guitar where it's a slide guitar, but it has like maybe more than one neck. It's got pedals and knee levers that change the tuning of the strings, and that those pedals are continuous, not discrete, which is really interesting. So you can slowly bend a note from one to the next. Developed in the 50s, Buddy Emmons, one of the main players, basically the virtuoso of the pedal steel, remains to this day the best pedal steel player ever, but also was one of the first. It's not fair. And then basically it's only used in country music and this gospel genre called sacred steel. So when you hear a pedal steel, you're like, oh yeah, country music. That's basically what most people know it as. Susan Alcorn is a really amazing player who actually just passed away a couple days ago, very sadly. But she was a big inspiration to me to get interested in the pedal steel guitar, where she plays pedal steel guitar, but not in either of those genres, in this kind of experimental free jazz world. Yeah. So there's a little dissertation by somebody you can read that's really interesting. T.D. Miller wrote a really cool thing. So I want to show one little video to show you what a real pedal steel is like and why I think this interaction is so cool. And then I'll show you the Electrosteel and what I ended up doing with that. So. So that's Paul Franklin of the Time Jumpers. The crazy thing about this instrument is that you can slide notes around in one direction at one speed while also sliding another note in a different direction at a different speed, all under your own control directly, not like, oh, I'm starting a slide and it happens autonomously. Like everything is under physical control simultaneously. Super exciting. I can't really think of other instruments that do that. There's a couple MPE controllers, MIDI polyphonic expression, that can do it, Hawken Continuum, touch keys, Rolly Seaboard. But it's pretty few and far between, and also none of those really have the same concept of, on a pedal steel, you have the concept of stops, where it's really like the pedal has a travel and then it has a very positive stop that you end on. So it's really easy to kind of go between one in-tune note and another in-tune note, but expressively. I find that really exciting, so. Yeah, maybe I'll skip around through a bunch of stuff just because obviously I always prepare way too much things. But here's what the Electrosteel ended up being. It's like the Electrobase. It's basically a synthesizer where on the right hand I've got these little pluck sensors, kind of coming back to the contraviel of days of yore. And then on the left hand, in this case, I've got these little resistive sensors that are sensing the position of the bar. And then I had to build some custom foot pedals for it and some knee levers. You can't really see them under there, but there's like little knee levers that you can push with your knees to change the pitch. Here's like a little example of it. So I'm going to end kind of with this. The thing that I find really interesting about this project in particular is kind of in relation to that idea of trying to make a full instrument. Like this one has its own embedded synthesis. It's not a controller. It's got its own kind of, in a way, it's not super original in the sense that it's borrowing from the interaction of the pedal steel guitar. And I'm trying to emulate it as much as possible and make it so that a pedal steel guitarist could sit down at this thing. But I also don't want it to sound like a pedal steel guitar. I want it to be a synthesizer that could make other sounds. But then one of the interesting things is I do feel like it ends up having its own sound. So this one I did make several prototypes. I made 10 of them, and then I've kind of, a year ago, I started shipping them out to people and having people try them for a few months. And like some of the great session players in Nashville have been borrowing them and doing around. There's a great session player in LA named Dan Kalisher who's had it for a year now. And it's been really interesting that they've sent me some of the tracks that they played it on. Like, this was like one of my dreams with it, is like, oh yeah, maybe it'll end up on some pop records. It'll ruin country music. And it kind of has, but it's on its way. But it's like, the really interesting thing is I do feel like it's very identifiable on those records, like the little bits that I've heard so far of something where somebody's like, oh, I used it on this session, check it out. And it's like, there is nothing else that could sound like that, because that particular interaction is what ends up kind of defining the sound. The fact that the notes are bending in this way, and there's also vibrato, and there's bar slant, but it's not a pedal steel, it's got this other sound. You can make it sound like an 8-bit Nintendo synth, but at the same time, the movement is really like very directly connected to the body. I don't know. I found that super exciting, and that's kind of where I'm at right now in my instrument development. The Electrobase and the Electrosteel have been kind of the most of my energy for the last 5 years, 6 years. Yeah. Hopefully this will give you guys hopefully this will give you some sense of the problems that I think about and like what I've been working on, but also, yeah, maybe it'll give you some concept of how this feedback loop between making music and building instruments can inform itself. That's my hope. All right, thanks very much. Yeah.